This video was created using artificial intelligence, AI, for educational and narrative purposes. All characters and events are fictionalized representations inspired by historical realities. Viewer discretion is advised. You were born into the gray, suffocating light of a city that had long ago forgotten the color of the sky. The room was a cramped tenement box, smelling of damp plaster, stale grease, and the metallic tang of an industrial district that never slept. Your first breath was thick with coal dust and the sour milk of a mother who was already translucent with exhaustion. There was no celebration, only the heavy rhythmic thud of the machinery in the factory next door, a sound that served as your first lullaby. The window was a jagged hole patched with oily rags, offering a view of an alley where the mud was permanent and the rats were bolder than the residents. You were not a miracle. You were a complication in a survival calculation that was already failing. Safety was an abstract concept, a word for people in the districts where the lights didn't flicker. For you, the world was a series of cold surfaces and sharp edges, an environment that was hostile before you even learned to crawl across the splintered floorboards. Your parents were not guardians. They were ghosts inhabiting the same wreckage as you. Your mother was a woman of sharp bones and a gaze that always seemed to be looking at something 3 inches behind your head. She did not hold you to soothe you. She held you like a heavy bundle she couldn't afford to drop. Your father was a collection of heavy footsteps and the smell of cheap fermented grain, a man whose presence was felt only through the sudden, unpredictable outbursts of frustration directed at the walls, the furniture, and occasionally, your mother. They did not teach you how to be a person. They taught you how to be small. They were broken by the same system that was already beginning to tighten its grip on your throat, and in their indifference, you found your first lesson. You were an island, and the water was rising. They were part of the decay, too tired to love you and too hollowed out to protect you from the draft that whistled through the gaps in the door. By the age of 6, you were useful, which was the only way you were allowed to exist. Childhood was a concept you saw in discarded newspapers, a myth about children who ran through grass. Your reality was the scrubbing brush and the heavy buckets of water you hauled up 4 flights of stairs until your shoulders burned with a dull, permanent ache. You learned the geography of the tenement through its filth, the way the grease accumulated in the corners, and the way the mold bloomed like dark flowers on the ceiling. There was no time for play, and the concept of a toy was a luxury your mind couldn't even process. You spent your days in service to the household's survival, cleaning the clothes of neighbors for a few copper coins, your small hands red and raw from the lie. Obedience was your only currency, and you spent it freely just to avoid the back of a hand or the denial of a meal. You were a servant before you were a child, a creature of labor defined by the tasks you completed. The law did not know you existed, and the city did not care. You were unregistered, a nameless figure in a sea of surplus humanity. There was no birth certificate tucked away in a drawer, no record in a government ledger that confirmed you occupied space on this earth. You were unseen by the institutions that claimed to manage the city, a shadow moving through the margins of a society that only looked at people like you when it needed to move them out of the way. If you had fallen into the river or disappeared into the dark maw of an alley, no search would have been conducted. You were a ghost while still breathing, a biological fact without a social identity. This invisibility was a quiet form of violence, a constant reminder that you were easy to discard because you had never truly been counted. You walked through the world knowing that you left no footprint, and the system was perfectly designed to keep it that way. Violence was the language of your neighborhood, a steady background hum that you learned to interpret before you could read. You were 8 when you watched a man being beaten to death over a piece of scrap metal just outside your door. You stood by the window and watched the rhythmic fall of the lead pipe, the way the body eventually stopped twitching, and the way the onlookers merely adjusted their collars against the cold. No one called for help because help didn't exist for people like him. This was your education in the cost of life. It taught you that the human body was fragile, and that its destruction was a common, unremarked upon event. You learned to keep your head down and your eyes averted, understanding that to witness cruelty was to risk becoming its next subject. The world was a predator, and you were its natural prey. Any day you weren't bleeding was a statistical anomaly you didn't expect to repeat. The only thing that kept you from becoming a total void was a small, three-legged dog you found shivering behind a crate of rotted cabbage. It was a pathetic creature, covered in sores and as hungry as you were. But for a year, it was the only thing in the universe that looked at you with recognition. You shared your meager crusts with it, and in the freezing nights, its warmth against your chest was the only reason you didn't turn into stone. It was your only bond, the only thing that didn't demand labor or silence in exchange for its presence. One morning, you woke to find the apartment door hanging open and the dog gone. Your father, his eyes bloodshot and his voice flat, told you he had sold it to a man from the tanning pits for the price of a bottle. There was no room for sentiment in a house of hunger. The loss was a physical weight, a hollowed-out space in your chest that never filled back up. You realized then that attachment was a luxury that invited pain, and you vowed never to be that vulnerable again. The rescue arrived when you were 15, wearing a clean uniform and speaking with the rehearsed kindness of a predator. An agency for social improvement conducted a sweep of the tenements, looking for able-bodied girls to fill the ranks of the city's overstretched medical wards. They promised you 3 meals a day, a clean bed, and the noble calling of nursing. They called it an opportunity to escape the squalor of your birth, a way to become a productive member of a grander machine. You went willingly, clutching the few rags you owned, believing that the heavy gates of the hospital represented a boundary between your past and a future. You didn't realize that the agency was merely a labor broker, and the hospital was not a place of healing, but a factory where the raw material was human suffering. They didn't save you. They simply harvested you, moving you from a disorganized slum into a highly organized system of exploitation. The first thing they did was take your name. At the intake desk, a woman with a face like a dried apple crossed out your family name and handed you a brass tag engraved with the number 402. You were told that personal history is a distraction to clinical efficiency. They stripped you of your clothes and burned them, a final ritual of erasure. You were scrubbed with harsh disinfectants until your skin was bright red, then dressed in a heavy, starched uniform that felt like a suit of cardboard. Your hair was hacked off to a uniform length to prevent lice, and you were given a handbook of 300 rules that governed everything from the way you folded a sheet to the way you lowered your gaze when a physician passed. You were no longer a girl from the tenements. You were a unit of service. You stopped being a person and became a function, a biological extension of the hospital's infrastructure, designed to perform repetitive tasks until your spirit was as flat as the linoleum floors. The hierarchy of the hospital was a rigid, unyielding pyramid of cruelty. At the top were the Board of Governors, men who existed only as signatures on memos, making decisions about resource allocation from wood-paneled offices miles away. Below them were the doctors, the high priests of the institution, who moved through the wards in silence, surrounded by a wake of terrified assistants. They spoke to each other over your head as if you were a piece of furniture, their white coats pristine and untouched by the fluids of the dying. Then there were the head sisters, women who had survived the system by becoming its most brutal enforcers, finding a cold pleasure in catching a junior nurse with a stray lock of hair or a smudge on her apron. You were at the very bottom, beneath the patients, because the patients were at least the reason the building existed. You were the grease in the gears, the disposable element that kept the hierarchy standing by absorbing all the pressure from above. Your body was no longer yours, it was a resource to be spent. The shifts were 18 hours long, sometimes stretching into 36 when the influx of the injured from the factories became too great for the beds to hold. You learned to sleep standing up against a damp wall, your eyes open but your mind dark. Your hands were permanently stained with the yellow of iodine and the gray of death, the skin peeling away in layers from the constant contact with caustic soaps. You lifted men twice your size, feeling the discs in your spine grind against each other, a pain that became a constant companion you eventually stopped noticing. Consent did not exist in this space. If a doctor needed you to hold a screaming patient still for an unanesthetized amputation, you did it. If a senior staff member needed someone to blame for a clerical error, you were the scapegoat. Your exhaustion was treated as a disciplinary flaw, a sign that you weren't dedicated enough to the institution that was slowly consuming your marrow. In the 4th year of your service, amidst the stench of the fever ward, you met Thomas. He was a porter, a man with broad shoulders and a quiet voice, who moved the dead with a gentleness that seemed impossible in a place like this. For 6 months, your lives intersected in the brief, stolen moments between rounds. He would leave a piece of dried fruit on your cleaning cart, or you would share a few whispered words in the drafty corridor behind the morgue. It was a fragile, desperate connection, a recognition that you were both still human, despite the numbers on your tags. He told you about a farm he remembered from his childhood, a place where the air didn't taste like ash, and for a few minutes every night, you believed him. He was the last piece of your humanity, a small flame burning in a cathedral of ice. You began to hope, which was the most dangerous thing you could do in a system built on despair. The system did not tolerate hope. It was a structural weakness. During an outbreak of the graypox, the hospital administration decided to quarantine the porter staff in the basement sublevels to ensure the wards remained clean. They were locked in without adequate food or medicine, a pragmatic decision to prevent the spread of the disease to the paying patients in the upper wings. You watched from the window as the doors were chained shut. You worked your shifts in the ward above, listening to the muffled sounds of coughing and shouting coming through the floorboards. When the doors were finally opened 2 weeks later, Thomas was one of the 74 bodies hauled out in a mass grave. There was no funeral, no acknowledgement of his service. He was just waste material to be disposed of. The message was clear. Attachment was a liability that the system would always find a way to liquidate. You didn't cry because your tear ducts had dried up years ago. You simply went back to scrubbing the floor where he used to stand. Survival required a total anesthesia of the soul. You began to see the patients not as suffering humans, but as sets of symptoms to be managed. You developed a coping mechanism of profound numbness, a mental fortress where no emotion could reach you. You moved through the wards like a clockwork doll, performing the rituals of care without a trace of empathy. You took the small doses of medicinal alcohol left over from the surgical trays, just enough to keep the world blurry, just enough to turn the screams into a distant melody. You weren't living. You were enduring. A biological machine that had successfully disconnected its consciousness from its physical reality. You were a perfect nurse now. A silent, efficient shadow that never complained and never felt. The numbness was your only shield, but it also meant that you were already dead, your heart having stopped beating long before your lungs would give out. The end came on a Tuesday morning, unremarked and unceremonious. You were 42 years old, but you had the body of a woman of 80, your bones brittle and your lungs scarred by years of breathing in the hospital's miasma. You were changing the linens on bed 12 when your heart simply decided it had fulfilled its quota. You felt a cold, sharp pull in your chest, a sudden clarity of the silence, and then the world tilted. You fell against the iron frame of the bed, your head lolling to the side as the life drained out of you. No one rushed to your side. The nurse on the next row didn't even look up. She was too busy counting bandages. You lay there for nearly an hour before a junior sister noticed you were obstructing the walkway. They rolled you onto a gurney, stripped you of your uniform so it could be laundered and issued to another girl, and wheeled you to the same morgue where you had once whispered to Thomas. Your death didn't cause a ripple. The ward stayed full, the doctors stayed distant, and the machinery of the hospital didn't miss a single beat. History has no memory of you. When the great chronicles of the city were written, they spoke of the golden age of medicine and the visionary architects who built the hospital's towering spires. They praised the advancements in surgery and the heroic doctors whose names are now etched in marble in the lobby. The thousands of women who burned out their lives in the dark hallways, who were erased by their uniforms and numbered tags, are nowhere to be found in the records. Your suffering left no trace on the world, no monument, no footnote. The institutions you served continue to grow, thriving on the quiet total erasure of individuals like you to maintain the illusion of progress. Your life was a resource to be extracted, and once the extraction was complete, the husk was discarded without a second thought. The gates of the hospital remain open, welcoming the next generation of the invisible to be consumed, and the system continues, unchanged and unbothered, forever hungry for more.